5. Rumbling storm clouds turned the day as nearly as black as the night had been, but Norik hardly noticed. His mind still sought to come to grips with the terror of the previous evening and his own limited part in it. More men had died brutally because of Norik's damned quest for gold. Although, unlike Satan and Watson, these had likely deserved execution for past crimes. Their deaths had been too awful as far as the soldier had been concerned. The innkeeper especially had suffered a horrible demise, the returning demon bringing back far too much proof of its thorough handiwork. Norik only gave thanks that the hellish beast had returned to the nether realm shortly thereafter with its prize. That, of course, had not enabled Norik to escape the suit's own monstrous actions afterwards. As the desperate fighter moved on, he tried not to look down at the armor greatly stained by the night's activities. Worse, each passing second, Norik remained aware that his own face still bore a few smudges despite his best attempts to rub off everything. The armor had been very thorough in its foul work, and while he fought off the horrors in his thoughts, the suit pushed him unceasingly west. Thunder rumbled again, and the wind howled, but still the armor moved on. Norik had no doubt that it would keep on moving, even in the storm. He had been granted one slight boon at least, the garnering of an old, dusty travel cloak hanging on a peg in the common room. The odds had been that it had belonged to the thieving innkeeper, but again Norik tried to avoid thinking of such things. The cloak obscured much of the armor and offered him a bit of protection should the rains come pouring down. A very small blessing, but one for which he was truly grateful. The more he headed west, the more the landscape changed, the mountains giving way to smaller hills and even flatlands. Now much farther down in altitude, it also grew increasingly warm. The plant life turned lush, becoming more and more reminiscent of the dense jungles the fighter knew existed further south. For the first time, Norik could also smell the sea. What he recalled of the maps he and his companions had carried indicated to him that the more northerly of the Twin Seas could not be that far away at this point. Norik's original hope had been to head southwest to find one of the Vajari, but he had suspicions that the cursed suit had other plans in mind. A fear briefly erupted within him that it might actually try to walk the breadth of the sea, dragging a helpless Norik into the inky depths. However, so far Bartok's armor had kept him alive, if not completely well. It apparently needed him breathing in order to achieve its mysterious goals. And after that, the wind continued to pick up, nearly buffeting Norik about, despite the determination of the cursed suit to keep on its course. No rain had yet fallen, but the air grew thick and moist, and fog began to develop. It became impossible to see very far ahead, and although it did not seem at all a bother to the armor, now and then Norik still feared that it would walk him right off a cliff without ever realizing it. At midday, which almost might as well have been midnight for all the sun failed to penetrate the cloud cover, imps again came in summons to the unintelligible words spouted unwillingly by Norik. Even despite the growing fog, it took them but minutes to bring back prey. This time a deer. Norik ate his fill, then gladly allowed the small horned demons to drag the rest of the carcass back into their infernal abode. On and on he trudged, the smell of the sea growing stronger. Norik could barely see in front of him, but knew that he could not be far from it, and whatever destination the infernal armor had in mind. As if reading his thoughts, a building abruptly materialized in the mist, followed almost immediately by another. At the same time he heard voices in the distance, voices clearly of those hard at work. His hands, his own for the moment, the exhaustion exhausted traveler pulled his cloak tight about him. The less any of the locals saw what he wore underneath, the better. As he wandered through the town, Norik sighted a dim but vast shape in the distance. A ship. He wondered whether or not it had just arrived, or now prepared to disembark. If the latter, it likely would be the armor's destination. Why else would he have brought him to this specific place? A figure in mariner's garb came from the opposite direction, a bundle under one arm. He had eyes and features somewhat akin to Fotson, but with much more animation in his face. "Ho, traveler! Not a good day to be making your way from the interior, eh?" "No." Norik would have walked past the man without another word, his concern that the mariner might become the next suit's victim, but the feet suddenly stopped. This, in turn, caused the other to also halt. Still grinning, the seaman asked, "Where do you hail from?" "Look to be a Westerner to me, though it's a little hard to tell under all that stubble." "West. Yes," the soldier returned. "I've been on a pilgrimage." "In the mountains?" "Not much up there, but a few goats." Nark tried to move his leg, but they would not budge. The armor expected something of him, but would not indicate what. He thought fast and furiously. He had arrived in a harbor town toward which the armor had purposely headed. Norik had already assumed that it needed transport to some location, possibly even the ship in the distance. The ship. Pointing toward the murky landscape, Norik asked, "The vessel, is it heading out soon?" The mariner twisted his head back to look. "Oh, the Neapolis? She's just come in. Be another 2, maybe 5 days even. Only ship leaving soon, the Hawksfire. Just down that way." He pointed toward the south, then leaned closer. Far too close in Norik's anxious opinion, and added, "Word of caution there. Hawksfire is not a good vessel. She'll be at the bottom of the sea one of these days, mark me. Best to wait for the Neapolis or my own fine girl, the Odyssey. Though that'll mean a week or more. We've need for a little refitting." Still his legs would not move. What more did the armor want? "Destination? Can you tell me where each sails to?" "My own, we're heading for Luke Ghislaine, but it'll be a while before we can leave it. As I said, the Neapolis now, that heads for the far Kingsport. A long journey, but a part of your western kingdoms, eh? Get you home faster, I think. That'd be the one for you, eh?" Nork noticed no change. "What about the Hawksfire?" "Leaves tomorrow morning, I think, but I warn you against it. One of these days she'll not make it way back from Luke Lane, and that's if she makes it there in the first place." The soldier's legs suddenly started moving again. The suit had finally found out what it wanted to know. Nor gave the mariner a quick nod. "Thank you." "Heed my warning well," the seaman called. "Best to wait." Bardak's armor marched north through the small town, heading to the southern part of the harbor. Mariners and locals glanced at him as he walked by. His western looks not as common here, but none made any comment. For all this tiny size, the port apparently had a steady business. Nork supposed that it would have looked more impressive in the sunshine, but doubted that he would have ever had the opportunity to see it so. A sense of unease touched the veteran as he entered the southernmost part of the port. In contrast to what Nork had seen so far, the area here looked to be in some disrepair, and those few figures he noticed nearby struck Nork as almost as unsavory as the unfortunate fools who tried to rob him. Worse, the only vessel in sight looked to be most appropriate for a journey desired by a cursed suit of armor. If some dark spirit had dredged up a long-lost ship from the black depths of the sea, then failed afterward in a half-hearted attempt to make it pass for something still from the land of the living, it would have looked little more than baleful than the Hawksfire did at the moment. The 3 masts stood like tall, skeletal sentinels half wrapped in shroud-like sails. The figurehead at the bow, once probably a curvaceous mermaid, had been worn down by the elements until it now resembled more an aquatic banshee in mid-shriek. As for the hole itself, something had long ago stained the wood nearly to pitch as the scars raked the sides, making Norik wonder if at some point in its colored past the vessel had either served in war or more likely had been used more than once as a freebooter. He saw no crew, only a single gaunt figure in a worn coat standing near the bow. Despite the uncertainty of taking a voyage on such a ghastly ship, Norik had no choice but to do so as the armor forced him. Without hesitation, it walked its unwilling host up the gangplank toward the rather haggard figure. "What do you want?" The skeleton coalesced into an older man with parchment skin and absolutely no flesh and sinew beneath the thin veil of life. One eye stared sightlessly to a point just to the left of Nork, while the other, bloodshot, glared suspiciously at the newcomer. "Passage. Luco Lane," replied Nork, trying to end this matter as quickly as he could. If he cooperated, then perhaps the warlord's garment would give him some freedom of movement for a while. "Other ships in port," the captain snapped, his accent thick. Under a broad-brimmed hat, he wore his ivory-white hair in a tail. The faded green coat, clearly once that of a naval officer from one of the western kingdoms, had likely gone through several owners before this man had laid claim to it. "No time to serve passengers." Ignoring the fetid breath, Nork leaned closer. "I will pay well to get there." An immediate change came over the captain's demeanor. "Aye." Trusting the armor to do as it had done at the end, the soldier continued. "All I need is a cabin and food. If I'm left alone for the duration of the journey, so much the better. Just get me to Luco Lane." The cadaverous figure inspected him. "Armor." He rubbed his chin. "An officer?" "Yes." Let him think Nork's some renegade officer on the run. Likely it would raise the price, but make the captain more trusting. Nork obviously needed to be away from here. The elder man rubbed his bony chin again. Nork noted tattoos running from his thin wrist down into the voluminous sleeve of the coat. The notion that his ship had served as a freebooter gained merit. 12 drachlin. Bed alone. Eat away from crew. Talk with crew little. Leave ship when docked. Nork agreed with everything except price. How much was a drachlin worth compared to the coin of his own land? He need not to have bothered worrying. The left hand stretched out, several coins in the gauntlet's palm. The captain eyed them greedily, scooping each from the proffered hand. He bit one to make certain of its worth, then poured all into a ragged pouch on his belt. "Come!" He hobbled past Norik, for the first time revealing that his left leg had splints running down each side all the way to the boot. From the extensive binding, he saw that his own experiences with field surgery, the veteran suspected that his host could not even stand on the leg without those large splints. The captain should have had the limb better looked at, but both the bindings and the splints appeared as if they had been put on quite some time ago and then forgotten. However much 12 drachlin might be in Nork's own land, his first viewing of the cabin led him to believe it far too great of a price for this. Even the room at the inn had looked more hospitable than what now confronted. The cabin barely outspanned a closet. Only a rickety bunk, whose side had been nailed to the back wall, represented anything in the way of amenities. The sheets were stained and looked as if they had been crudely cut from the sails. So dark and coarse they were. A smell like rotting fish pervaded the cabin, and marks on the floor hinted of some past violence. In the upper corners, spiderwebs larger than Nork's head wiggled in the breeze, let in by the open door, and near the edge of the floor, moss of some sort had taken a foothold. Knowing he had no choice, Nork hid his disgust. Thank you, Captain. Costco, the skeletal figure grunted. Inside! Eat at Bell! Understand? Yes. With a curt nod, Captain Costco left him to his own devices. Heeding the man's advice, Nork shut the door behind him and sat down on the dubious bed. To his further regret, the cabin did not have a porthole, which might have offered some relief from the stench. He flexed his hands, then tested his legs. Movement had been granted to him for his cooperation, but for how long, Nork could not say. He supposed that aboard the Hawksfire, the armor expected little trouble. What could Nork do except step over the rail and sink to the bottom of the sea? As terrible as his situation had grown, he could not yet bring himself to try to end his life, especially in such horrifying fashion. Besides, Nork doubted that he would be allowed to even do that, not so long as the suit required his living body. With no notion as what else to do with this time, he tried his best to go to sleep. Despite the stench, or perhaps because of it, Nork managed to doze off. Unfortunately, his dreams proved again to be troubled ones, in great part because they did not even seem like his own. Again, he lived as Bartuk, taking relish in the dreadful acts he performed. A settlement that hesitated too long in accepting his domination felt the full force of his righteous wrath. The town elders and several other chosen fools drawn, quartered, then flayed for the good of the rest. A Vajeri caught spying became the centerpiece for a macabre canabrilla that illuminated not only the warlord's quarters, but even caused his demonic servants to shudder. A bell sounded. Stirring a grateful Nork from his sleep, he blinked, finally registering that he had actually slept until the bell for the evening meal. While he doubted the food would be anything to his liking, his hunger had become so great that Nork could not avoid the matter any longer. Besides, he did not want to risk the suit summoning imps to feed him. There was no telling what they might decide could be edible. Pulling his cloak tight around him, the fighter stepped out to see several worn, bitter-looking men heading down into the bow of the ship. Assuming that they, too, planned to eat, Nork followed them down to a rather seedy-looking mess. In silence, the former soldier stood in line, receiving hard bread and a questionable meat dish that almost made him yearn for the thieving innkeeper's fare. One glance at the surly group convinced Nork to retire to his room. Carrying his food up the deck, he paused at the rail for a moment to inhale some of the relatively fresh sea air before going back into the cabin. A figure standing in the fog-enshrouded dock caught his eye. The food slipped from his hands, spilling all over the deck, but Nork did not even notice. Fotson. Even with his robes wrapped around him, it could be no other. The dead eyes of his former comrades stared back at him. Even from where the fighter stood, he could see the gaping hole where the Vajera's throat had once been. Fool! Costco roared from behind Nork. What mess! You clean up! No help! The startled veteran looked over his shoulder at the angry captain, then down at the spilled food. Some of the meat dripped over the toes of Bartuk's boots. Clean up! No help! No more food tonight! Costco limped off, muttering in his native tongue something no doubt derogatory about foreign devils. Despite the fury of the captain, Nork immediately forgot the spilled meal, instead quickly returning his gaze to the dock in search of nothing. No sepulchral figure stood staring back at him. The ghastly shade had vanished, if it had ever been there in the first place. Hands trembling, he stumbled back, unmindful of anything but the terrifying sight he had thought he had just beheld. Fotson, so clearly dead, condemning him with those empty eyes. Still ignoring Captain Costco's earlier demand that he clean up the mess, Nork hurried back to his cabin, slamming the door tight behind him and not daring to breathe until he sat once more on the bunk. He had lost the struggle. The sorcerer's ghost had been the first obvious sign. Nark had lost the struggle for his sanity. The horrors the cursed armor had put him through had finally torn away the last barriers protecting the veteran's mind. Surely now the downward spiral into complete madness would be swift. Surely now he had no hope of saving himself. Surely now Bartuk's legacy would claim not only his body, but his soul, too. An exhausted Kara Night Shadow inspected the miserable little port town with some distaste. Accustomed to the beauty of the jungle and the carefully cultivated ways of her kind, she found the port cool, reeking of too many unwashed bodies and far too much devotion to materialistic things. As a necromancer, Kara saw the world in balance between the actions of life and that which occurred after death, and believed that both aspects should be dealt with accordingly with as much dignity as a soul could muster. What she had so far witnessed in her few minutes here had revealed very little dignity. It had taken her great effort to reach this place as quickly as she had, effort that had worn her out physically, spiritually, and very much magically. Kara dearly wanted to get some sleep, but she had come to this place for reasons that even she did not completely understand, and so needed to at least survey the area in the hopes of finding some answers. After the unsettling loss of not only the warlord's armor, but also both her prized dagger and the two corpses, the young necromancer had used her training to try to ferret out the locations of all, and that had unerringly led her to this most unassuming place. What ties the port might have to all she could not say, but it clearly did not bode well. Kara wished that she could have consulted with her teachers, but time had been of the essence, and she had been trained to rely on herself as much as possible. Delaying the chase only meant it becoming more difficult to track everything later on. That she could not afford. If the thieves planned on taking the armor overseas, she had to stop them now. As for revelations, she had no idea what to do about the unsettling pair. They acted like nothing spoken of in her studies. Ignoring the unsavory glances from the sailors she passed, Kara headed for the first inn she found. On one hand, the Ebony Trust enchantress needed food, while on the other, she hoped to garner some useful information. Surely those who carried Bartuk's suit had needed a meal or drink after such an arduous trek. The captain's table, as the inn had been tilted, proved to be better in appearance than she expected. Although the building looked old and worn, the gray-haired, imposing man in charge kept it clean and orderly. Kara immediately knew that he had once been an officer in some naval force, from his features likely one of the wealthier western kingdoms. Cheerful for the most part, the gigantic figure with mutton chop sideburns brooked no argument from one patron who believed he could depart without paying. Despite his advanced age, the innkeeper handled the much younger seaman with ease, not only retrieving the money owed him, but also depositing the culprit out in the fog and mud. Rubbing his hands on his apron, the owner noticed his newest guest. "Good evening, my lady." He bowed gracious, despite his growing girth, his entire expression lighting up at the sight of her. "Captain Hanos Jaranan, your humble servant. May I say you grace my little place." Unaccustomed to such open display toward her, Carr did not answer at first. However, Captain Jaranan, clearly realizing that he had overwhelmed her, patiently waited for her to recover. "Thank you, Captain," she finally responded. "I seek some food, and if you have the time, the answers to a few questions? For you, my lovely little one, I'll make the time. He walked off, humming to himself. Kara felt her face reddening. Captain Geronin obviously meant nothing forward in his comments, but none of the dark mage's interest training had taught her how to take compliments on her appearance. She knew that some of her brethren found her attractive, but among the followers of Rathma, such matters were treated with the formality with which they treated everything. Seating herself in a side booth, Carr glanced around at the other patrons. Most went about the business of drinking and eating, but a few had other matters in mind. She saw a woman in a scandalous garments leaning over a sailor, her offer to him needing little actual conversation. To her right, a pair of men dickered over some deal, babbling in a language of which the necromancer had no knowledge. There were also a few males among the clientele who eyed her with more open interest than Captain Geronin had, and without his tact. One who showed far too much interest in her own taste received a stony glare from her silver eyes, a sight so unsettling to him that he quickly turned away, burying his head in drink and visibly shivering for several seconds. The innkeeper returned with a plate bearing broiled fish and some sea vegetable. He placed that and a mug in front of the necromancer. Cider in the mug. 'Tis the simplest drink I've got here, my lady. Carr considered telling him something about the strong herbal concoctions developed by the Rathma faithful, but chose to graciously accept the mild drink. She looked at the fish, the spices giving it a very enticing scent. Of course, at this point, Kara almost would have been willing to eat it right out of the sea. Still, it pleased her to find such civilized fare here. What do I owe? Your company alone's worth the price. She bristled, thinking of the woman plying her wares on one of the customers. I am no... He looked chagrined. No, no, 'tis that I just don't get such fair visitors much, lass. I only meant sitting here and answering your questions. No harm meant. Geronin leaned closer, whispering, and I know better than trying to force myself on one who follows the ways of Rathma. You know what I am, and still you desire to sit with me? My lady, I've sailed every sea, and all over the great ocean. I've seen many a magic, but the most trustworthy of mages were always the faithful of Rathma. She rewarded him with a slight smile that proved enough to redden his already ruddy cheeks. Then perhaps you are a man with whom I can trust my questions. The captain leaned back. Only when you've tasted my specialty and given me your fine opinion. Kara cut into the fish, tasting a small bite. Immediately she cut a second, downing as quickly as the first. Jordan beamed. 'Tis to your liking, then. Indeed it was. The jungles of the east contained a variety of marvelous spices, but the necromancer had never eaten anything like this fish. In less time than she could have ever imagined, Kara had devoured a good portion of her meal, so much so that she finally felt like herself again. Captain Geronin had excused himself now and then to deal with his other customers, but by the time she had finished, there remained only two other pairs, a pair of dour-looking sailors, clearly too weary to do anything but nurse their ails and food. The innkeeper settled in across from her and waited. My name is Karen Nightshadow, she began. You know what I am. Aye, but I've never seen one that looked like you, lass. Kara pushed on, unwilling at this point to be deterred by niceties. Captain, have you noticed anyone out of the ordinary here? He chuckled. And gay cool? It'd be more extraordinary to see somebody ordinary. What about a man traveling with armor, probably strapped to the back of an animal? The necromancer paused to consider the implications further. Or a man wearing armor. We get some soldiers here, not uncommon. In crimson plate? Jordan's brow wrinkled. I'd recall that. But no one. No one. It had been a desperate hope. Kara wanted to ask another very particular question, but feared that if she did, the captain's easy manner would change. He might be familiar with her kind, but some subjects could be too dark even for him to accept. Walking corpses would certainly be one of those subjects. Kara opened her mouth with the intention of trying a different track, yet what escaped from her lips proved not to be words, but rather a long yawn. Her companion looked her over. Pardon me for being blunt, milady, but you look even more pale than likely you usually are. I think you need some good rest. She sought to dissuade him, only to yawn again. Perhaps you're right. I've got a couple of rooms available, lass, for you, no charge, and nothing expected, if you're worried about it. I'll pay you. Kara managed to retrieve some coins from the purse on her belt. Is this enough? He shoved most of it back. That is, and don't go showing all that money around. Not everyone's kind soul like me. The necromancer could barely move. Her legs felt like lead. The spell work she had utilized to quicker get her to her destination had taken too much from the dark mage. I think I will go immediately, if you will forgive my leaving. Best give me a few minutes, lass. I fear that with the help I hire here, it may not be ready for you. Just remain here and I'll be back shortly. He hurried off before she could protest. Kara straightened, trying to keep awake. Both the spellwork and her own physical efforts naturally had drained her much, but this exhaustion seemed far more oppressive than it should have been. Even taking those manners into account, it almost made her believe. She pushed herself to her feet, turning to the door at the same time. Perhaps Kara had misjudged Captain Hannes Tyrannin. Perhaps his congenial manner hid a darker side. But whether her thinking might be too muddled, the necromancer stumbled her way to the entrance, not at all caring what the two sailors in the corner might think. She made it outside, then perhaps she would clear her mind enough to reconsider. Yes, for all the odious smells of the port itself, the sea air would still no doubt help her regain her balance. Kara nearly fell through the doorway, so weak had her legs become. Immediately she inhaled. Some of the heaviness in her head evaporated, enough at least for her to get some general sense of her surroundings. But the raven-haired enchantress needed more. She could not decide what to do about the innkeeper until she could think clearly again. Once more she inhaled, but as her head cleared a bit more, a sense of immediate unease struck Kara. She looked up into the dark fog and saw a figure in a worn travel cloak, standing just a few feet from her. His face remained obscured by the hood of his cloak, but lower Kara could make out a pale hand emerging. In that hand the figure held a dagger that gleamed even in the mist-enshrouded night. An ivory dagger. Kara's dagger. Another pale hand reached up and pulled back the hood slightly, revealing a face the necromancer had seen once before. The Vajere from Bardac's tomb. Your spell should have worked better on her, a voice croaked from behind her. Kara tried to turn, but her body still moving far too slowly. At the same time, it occurred to her that all her training, all her spell work, had failed to enable her to notice not one attacker, but two. A second pale face smiled grimly at her. The man's head tipped slightly to one side, as if not entirely connected to his body. The second corpse of the tomb. The wiry man whose neck had been snapped. You leave us no choice. His hand had been raised. In it, another dagger, held hilt up. Even as this fact reached her sluggish brain, the hand of the ghoul came down, swinging hard. The blow caught Kara Night Shadow in the temple. She spun around once, and she would have surely cracked her head on the stone path, save that the undead creature who had hit her now caught her in his arms. With astonishing tenderness, he lowered the stunned woman to the ground. You Really? Leave us. No choice. And with that, she blacked out.